you want to introduce yourself properly?
Yeah, I can introduce myself properly. So quite a new person here at Wessex. So as I think Beth said, so I'm an environmental archaeologist. So sort of my areas of specialism are in plant remains and wood and charcoal, although more broadly, I do sort of have this interest across all sort of things that we can study in environmental archaeology, which ultimately is sort of aiming to understand the interaction between humans and their environment. So there's sort of several topics I'm very interested in, such as past agriculture and past ecological changes, hence the subject of that talk.
Can you expand a little on the evidence for how hunter-gatherer groups managed woodlands in the UK/Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an area I do find really interesting, mainly because it sort of blurs the boundary between what we would call a hunter-gatherer and a farmer. And so it can be quite difficult to detect archaeologically, but we do have some really good evidence for it. So one of the main ones would be, we know that hunter-gatherers exploited hazel trees very intensively, partly to get the wood. So the poles that hazel produces are extremely useful for various purposes, such as making fish traps or construction in houses, settlements. So hazel naturally sort of coppices itself. So the trunk will fall down slightly and it'll produce these very fast growing upright poles. However, humans can very much help that process along by just clear cutting the tree to the ground, and then it will sprout up very rapidly. And that happens to actually lots of broadleaf trees in the UK. And then one other thing that they undoubtedly must be doing, because hazel is almost overrepresented in archaeological images, we really know they're targeting it in particular, is that they were probably clearing areas of woodland to encourage hazel to flower and produce hazelnuts, because it doesn't do so enclosed woodland. And exactly the same happens with wild fruits such as crabapple and wild pear. They will fruit when they're in light, but they won't if it's closed dense woodland. And there are other species then that would have benefited from these woodland clearings. So brambles being another one, producing blackberries and as well as raspberries. On the other idea would be that if they're burning these landscapes, they're potentially also creating new browsing habitats for herbivores which they could hunt. So that's just some of the ways they could sort of manage these landscapes. Sometimes they may have even been directly propagating plants. Such we've certainly got modern ethnographic evidence of that, of people, say, propagating yams and sort of unconsciously but also consciously sort of spreading the plants further and further.
So the next question is, what do you think would be a key species to reintroduce to the UK?
Yeah, well, this can get a very controversial topic, which can understandably upset some landowners and particularly farmers. I think the beavers are probably going to be one of the most important. I believe they've been reintroduced officially, and then there have been some unofficial reintroductions, and they are going to spread from those habitats, or at least they're being closely monitored. The reason that beavers are really interesting is that they were present actually until quite relatively recent. It was only really in the medieval period where they were last sort of exterminated, essentially, because they were seen as a nuisance. It's quite surprising to think how people didn't notice them sooner, because they're not exactly, they're quite obvious in the landscape. Their dams are quite noticeable. But the sort of beavers we would have in the UK would be quite different from the American ones, which create these huge dams. We're not talking about a situation like that. But the reason that beavers are really interesting is that whilst they can remove some small areas of farmland, they can actually overall alleviate flooding by creating these mosaic habitats. So they can slow down water discharge and runoff, and then actually create these really biodiverse habitats by encouraging other species to grow. And I think they would be quite a good one to reintroduce, because we don't have, say, the issues that introducing large predators such as wolves or lynx would have, particularly in a landscape such as the UK, which is quite densely populated. We don't have some of these vast areas where such species could be so easily reintroduced.
Okay, great. So the next question is, European bison have recently been introduced to the Blean woodland in Kent. If I'm saying that right, sorry if I'm not. Are you aware of any faunal records for this species in Britain? So is this a reintroduction or an introduction of a new species?
So this is kind of a sort of a reintroduction in some way. We did sort of we had aurochs in the UK in the Mesolithic period and in the early farming communities. So they sort of die out by about the Bronze Age, so around 2000 years ago. They existed in Poland a lot longer, I think until the 17th century. So we had very similar megafauna, or something we would call. So quite chunky animals basically moving around woodlands, you know, sort of quite different from your squirrel or something like that. But yeah, one of the problems we face with this is that because we killed off the native animals, we have to reintroduce them, and their behavior will not always necessarily be the same as it would have been in the past. So it can be a bit of a complicated scenario. So one way people try to get around this in the Netherlands is there's a breed of cattle called Heck cattle. They're actually bred by the Nazis as sort of back breeding. They were trying to create this sort of very wild cow, in essence, something a bit more like an auroch, or and so what we'll probably see is more wilder farming as such, introducing very traditional domestic breeds that are just a bit hardy and a bit more suited to living in these sort of environments on their own.
Yeah, great. Okay, so next question is, how do you see the role of environmental archaeology and paleobotany within the issues of climate change and the migration of habitats?
So I think, yeah, it's a really difficult one. Like one of the biggest challenges we have is creating a common language across our disciplines. So I think it's really easy for archaeologists to work in isolation and ecologists to work from isolation. And although, say, for instance, both subjects will tap into a really diverse source of subjects to sort of produce the information they need, creating a common dialogue across our disciplines has been a real challenge. And so now there are some really good examples of where these two disciplines have been brought together really effectively. And one is a project called Land Cover 6000, which is essentially trying to create a very simple language that can be used in models to understand past land use. And so essentially we both need to keep producing our data, but just trying to do it in a format that can be used by both and trying to work together more effectively, really.
I think that can cover a lot of things, being able to work together better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is, in some landscapes where a rewilding project might take place, a certain period's archaeological signature may be more prominent than others, so like a prehistoric or medieval. How closely do you think rewilding projects should align and sympathise with these archaeological signatures in their given areas? Do you think there may be instances where an imposition of another period's ecological character might be more beneficial?
Yeah, so this is, for instance, this heathland habitats are a really good example of that, in that heather, although it's a native species, humans have massively expanded its range through practices such as burning it and managing it. So these heathlands were such valuable resources as like fuel, as animal fodder, building material. They were also used for grazing and arable cultivation. And yeah, it can be a really difficult one to know what to restore. So for instance, Epping Forest in North London used to have massive areas of heathland, absolutely enormous areas. Yet when the decision was taken, I think in the mid-20th century, to sort of revert to a different style of conservation practices. And people now would say, perhaps that was wrong, perhaps we should have kept those heathlands. Because the problem with these heathland habitats, they're often bordered by woodland. The trees can very, very easily spread to them, and then you've changed that habitat, perhaps permanently. And so for instance, in that instance, we would be saying, oh, well, we're recreating a medieval habitat, possibly one that's Roman. It could have elements that are earlier. But yeah, it can be a really difficult one to know what we should conserve. And I suppose this is where this idea that perhaps these cultural landscapes that we've created are equally valid conservation targets in their own right. Now, humans have we have done some good stuff. to our environments sometimes. We've created more biodiverse areas. We've really helped some species along. But it can be, it can be a really difficult one to know exactly what we want to create. And what I'm just trying to emphasize in this talk is that we just can't recreate a truly wild landscape, because there's not really such a thing anymore.
Okay, so next question is, what do you think about George Peterkin's ideas about how natural ecologies form by the interactions between the agency of plants, animals, and humans, both after abandonment and over long periods of time? So, for example, what might be called semi-natural grasslands or woodlands that move back to being natural?
That is the sort of partly what I was trying to encapsulate in this talk. There's some quite interesting research done in France, which has shown that, so where you had your Roman settlements, when the Roman settlement was in its heyday, they were surrounded by an arable landscape. Then after that settlement went out of use, it was then colonized by woodland. However, that woodland still differs significantly from other areas of woodland, showing how that Roman settlement actually has left a permanent legacy on that landscape and those soils, so that it will never revert back to the same landscape it was before. And we also see the same thing in Greenland with when the Norse settlements were abandoned. You see elevated nitrogen concentrations across the grasslands that formed on there, subsequently getting different species. So it is again very much recognizing that you get these landscapes are formed through the interaction of multiple processes, with humans being quite a key player in that.
Great. So the next one is, I'm quite interested to find out the answer to this myself. How would you introduce species like wolves in a way that wouldn't threaten people?
That unfortunately is probably best answered by an ecologist. I think it'd be really interesting to see them. And where they were reintroduced in Yellowstone National Park in America, it's really interesting to see what they did. But it's such a different scenario because it's such a big landscape there compared to the UK. It's quite hard to find areas of the UK that are not inhabited, or at least densely inhabited. And I know from reading some more sort of broad ecology books about this, I think the idea generally they would have to be fenced off and monitored quite carefully. But it is a very emotive subject in reintroducing species such as wolves, because I know the reintroduction of the sea eagle has caused a bit of controversy because it's quite a big bird and can take off some small livestock.
Yeah, we're quite a small country to be doing things like that compared to America. Yeah. Okay, so next question is there any existing or is there any work on producing mapping of likely past or rewilding climax/matrix landscapes across the UK? Or perhaps some defined habitat descriptions based on current geology, soil and climate, etc.
So in the UK, we have something called the National Vegetation Classification, which is a grouping of all vegetation habitats that can exist in the UK. And they're normally defined by sort of two species. So for instance, you could have your oak, holly, woodland to say those are your two dominant species. And then that vegetation group will have sub-communities, and it'll have all the different sort of plants that will commonly grow in that. And it's quite an in-depth and complex scenario, and it works well to modern habitats. It becomes very difficult to apply archaeologically because the sort of nature of the remains we get are not easily translatable back into the relative proportions of different species always. So for instance, if we find a few fragments of oak charcoal and a few fragments of charcoal from other species, it's very difficult to relate that directly back to trees. We can begin to do that if we look at enough data across the landscape. Pollen analysis is better at reconstructing the relative proportions of species within a past habitat. Or again, it does come into some issues in that some species don't show up so well in pollen records. But there's also recognition of the idea that there will be habitats in the past which have no analog in the present. So for instance, one of these is in the early Holocene, there were yew woodlands on bogs essentially in London. That that habitat doesn't have a modern analog, and so it would be quite difficult to recreate. But there are certainly archaeological papers that I know that have, say for instance, the New Forest, tried to say this is what the past landscape would have looked like, and they've done that also in Epping Forest. So we can sort of get an idea of what the classification should have been like, but it's actually really, really hard to nail down what it was like.
Okay, great. So the next question is, please could you explain a bit more about why the Irish and UK ancient woodlands are similar and Ireland didn't have the large herbivores?
It's partly the fact that Ireland is an island, so they didn't make it across these large herbivores. What is interesting is that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers quite probably introduced wild boar, and Neolithic farmers also introduced more animals into them. Yeah, I think that sort of covers it as an essence. It's because it's an island, so it's just harder for them to get there.
Next question is, do you think commercial archaeology companies will be a part of rewilding schemes in the future if they aren't already?
I would certainly, the data that we produce already is being used in or sort of contributing to projects looking at this. That's undoubtable, because commercial archaeology, it produces the vast bulk of data that could be used to inform past rewilding. And I know, so for instance, Historic England currently have a project where they've been synthesizing all of the plant remain data from the UK and pollen and data to sort of create this database of past biodiversity changes. So very much so, the data we're using is already directly feeding into it. So.
Okay, brilliant. So next question is, the Central/Western European primeval forest as a model for rewilding in the UK and Europe isn't all-encompassing for a natural wild state of the landscape free from impacts of human activity. In your opinion, is the scope of flora and fauna species currently being reintroduced too narrow for successful restabilization of the environment? How far back do we need to look to restore a truly wild ecosystem?
Yeah, so if I was to sort of step back first slightly, so when we are, say, looking at plant remains, we can often classify them as things as neophytes, to say they were introduced sort of post 1500, and then archaeophytes, which were introduced pre 1500. Some of those archaeophytes were introduced in sort of the Middle Bronze Age or Neolithic, or earlier in the Neolithic. Some of the main periods of sort of archaeophyte introduction, and these are normally sort of weeds of disturbed places, and they were introduced in the Roman and medieval periods, often as contaminants of grain crops. To some extent, I think we haven't killed off too many of our native plant species for rewilding to not work as such. We still have our native tree species. I think one of the concerns has been that to plant trees, we would perhaps need to introduce stock grown elsewhere. And there have been some interesting experiments where birch trees planted from stock grown elsewhere didn't work. They didn't grow very well. However, naturally self-seeded birch within the same area did fantastically. It was very happy. And likewise, we don't necessarily actually need to import planted trees. If you have a woodland near a grassy area, it's surprising how quickly that area will revert back to woodland. And we know that from experiments done in Cambridge, where it really will be in the space of 10 to 20 years that you will see quite an impressive shrubby sort of undergrowth of woodland developing.
Do you think transitioning arable land from non-native cereal farming to permaculture use has a place in the rewilding conversation, as it can rejuvenate soil health to a more natural balance and lead to healthy biodiversity, for example, like wildflower meadows and things like that?
Yeah, there's certainly a case for changing how we produce food, or at least actually rather how we farm in the UK. And with perhaps general consensus, we should move towards the idea of wilder farming. So trying to be as sensitive as we can to the ecology of the landscape, I suppose one of the concerns we have in the UK is that actually a lot of the arable land we grow crops on is for animal food rather than directly for human food. So producing animal fodder is not the most efficient way of producing food, and certainly there is scope that we could reduce the amount of arable land in cultivation and move towards more theoretically sustainable forms of production without actually having that much of an overall impact on sort of what we're doing. So that much of an overall impact on food production. And certainly, well, things in the UK will change now that we've left the European Union. We're not under the common scheme anymore, and I think it's all to be decided exactly how things are going to develop in the UK and how things are going to change. But certainly there's going to be far greater emphasis on minimizing the environment impact of farming as much as possible. But there are already environmental schemes as part of farming. So,
given the likelihood that climate change will lead to certain habitat species becoming extinct, do we need to move away from trying to create an ancestral wilderness to one which will be adapted to changing rainfall and drought parameters?
yeah, essentially we do. And we can actually also look at this in archaeology as well. So we can correlate past vegetation changes with past climate changes to see when certain species did really well and when other species did not do so well. So, for instance, particularly wet period, say in northern England in the Roman period, probably facilitated the expansion of heathland vegetation alongside various other factors such as humans actually, clearing woodland to help that habitat expand. So the two factors work together, and certainly we can look back in time to understand how vegetation has responded in the past to climate change to understand how it might respond in the future. Right.
So do you know of anyone, academic or otherwise, who might want to study a site where there has been some excellent natural regeneration over the past 20 years and shows many of the natural processes such as pollarding?
Yeah.
Is that right? By deer, scrub matrices, population from adjacent woodland, etc. So do you know anyone that would be
interested in studying it?
Yeah.
I'm sure I know many people who'd be very interested. There's been some really, well, there's some very good books already out that have sort of looked at this. Oliver Rackham is one of the best. His books are very accessible to non-academics, and so he's he passed a few years ago, but he was the expert on studying these things, and he's got some really good examples of showing how these areas can regenerate, basically. So
we are all out of questions. So thank you so much, Ed. This has been absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much to everyone attending.